Okay, let's take a look at what the book has to say about the 90s. The first thing that they talk about is the sheer number of different artists that were at the top. And we'd seen a little bit of that when we looked at the rock appreciation timeline here. There's a broad mixture of different types of artists. That was a pretty exciting thing about the 90s. The singles market began to shrink. And this was because they wanted to sell CDs. If you remember, those CDs came out in the late 1980s. Well, the 90s was the decade of the CD. So although it was important to have a #1 song if you could, the best thing you could do was sell more albums. Similar to the 70s, you'll see that the top-selling albums of the decade and the people who had the #1 hits, if you go into a particular year here, that those two people could be very different. Okay, MC Hammer, Vanilla Ice didn't sell as many albums as Alanis Morissette and Nirvana, even though they had #1 songs. This idea of this alternative music movement that happened was not tied just to rock and roll. Again, it also happened in hip-hop, where we had the emergence of hardcore gangster rap coming out, where people were swearing and talking about other people in ways that we hadn't heard before. It also happened in country music. Oddly enough, country music began to sound more like pop or rock music, which was considered radical at the time. Some of the biggest artists in country, like Garth Brooks, Shania Twain, at the time were hard to call country, although today we do. So the music we're going to look at with rock is considered alternative music. And there was the emergence of a new trend called techno music or electronica music, and that's going to be the other main genre that we hear today. Started in the 1990s when we can start to use the computer for producing music. What do they mean by alternative? Well, lots of different things. As I just mentioned, we had alternative dance, alternative country, alternative rock. Anything that sounded like the record company didn't produce it, that it came from a person first, is what people wanted to hear. And it applied across almost all the genres. Again, very different than the 70s and 80s. We hadn't heard this since the 1960s. We saw a lot more small clubs and small record labels. The idea that it was iconoclastic and anti-commercial was very important. And of course, the record companies understood this. So here's a quote from a record company saying that, hey, we made up these labels to try to fool. Most people can still tell. And so most of these artists that did make it big wrote their own music and did come from small beginnings in a smaller record label. The record companies started to produce these sub-companies, these smaller record labels that would go into the clubs to hear the next greatest thing emerging. Something that we didn't really have in the 70s and 80s. So alternative rock will always be linked with punk, even though punk had collapsed in the 70s and wasn't a major player in the 1980s in terms of record sales. It had a following in college music radio stations and undergrounds. People wanted that sort of personal, defiant sound throughout the 80s. That's where these bands are going to draw their energy from and their influence from. Again, most of the music is going to be listened to by white, male, middle, and working class people. The book here talks about some of those new topics and the positions that the music takes towards it. Drugs, suicide, depression, even environmental things. We'd only heard that from U2 in the 80s. People are going to start wearing torn jeans. Now this seems common, right, to wear jeans with holes in them, but that was pretty radical at the time. People start pulling their pants down and low so you could see their underwear. This was all anti-establishment, alternative approaches. And many of the bands that made it big had a problem with it, right? Again, we talk about those artists who had committed suicide or were stuck in drug use. R.E.M. is an example. They were an 80s band who really were able to ride on this alternative music scene. Probably one of the very few bands to transition from the 80s into the 90s. Sonic Youth might be a band that many of you don't know, but Sonic Youth really influenced this grunge scene, along with Dead Kennedys. These bands were West Coast punk movement. There was also the Germs, Flag X, the Circle Jerks, Butthole Surfers, lots of obviously mainstream names. And then the book talks about how Metallica's 91 album was really the one that allowed metal to come into the mainstream. And then the next year, Nirvana came out with their album, and we now had generalized acceptance of that grunge punk metal sound. It was fairly significant that Nevermind had displaced Michael Jackson's album at the time, Michael Jackson being obviously the king of pop in the 80s, and Nirvana coming in, a band that sounded like they never wanted to even be that popular, coming in and nudging aside the biggest pop artist for the last decade. We hear a lot of the similar songwriting techniques, like I said, that makes those songs listenable, and yet the presentation and the way it's done is very anti-establishment. And the success is going to destroy Nirvana. You can see here some quotes about that kind of sarcastic, sardonic attitude. It was very fitting for the Gen X audience and performers. They're going to do radical things on stage, not in the same way of like ripping off a chicken's head, but like kissing each other on stage or wearing women's clothing, doing really kind of self-degrading things that no one was supposed to do at the time, and then, like I said, accumulating in him committing suicide. It was anti-establishment to the point where they took their own life. The book talks a little bit about Phish and Dave Matthews and how these jam bands, so back to the jam bands over here, how they were emerged in importance in the 1990s. And the book builds on the idea of the Seattle sound, which was the grunge scene. Let me tell you, for 2 years there, everybody dressed and acted just like they were from people from Seattle. They wore kind of the plaid clothing. Their hair was long and scraggly and unkempt. They didn't take showers. Similar to the Summer of Love, but this was more like the summer of grunge, or the summer of discontent and angst. As I had shared earlier, the singer-songwriter, the alternative singer-songwriter scene became very important. Alanis Morissette and Sheryl Crow being the biggest of those. Ani DiFranco was very important in it too. She sang like a folk rock style, but was much more feminist in her music. She made it big, but never sold as many records as these artists because she didn't want to. She rejected that commercialized way of being. And we're going to see more of those kind of feminist artists come out. Ani DiFranco, and then even in the hip-hop side, we'll see Lauryn Hill. And these artists are going to start to stand up for more women's rights and in some ways reject the way that hip-hop was talking about women and continues to this day. The idea of being conscious, we haven't seen a lot of that since the 1960s as well. We're not so mainstream. We're thinking about ourselves. We're reflecting, thinking about the world and how maybe it's not so great or needs to change. And what we start to see in the 1990s is the rise of world music, meaning that as the internet starts to peek into mainstream everyday life and people are starting to get emails, we're going to start to see the rest of the world. And that's really going to be the changes that are going to happen as we move into the 2000s. If rock music is the music of the baby boomer generation, its inability to transition to a more technical age, its unwillingness to set down the guitar and adopt things like the synthesizer or MIDI programming, allow other genres such as hip-hop, pop, and even techno to take the lead as we move into the internet age, as we move into Napster. And from 2000 on, the top-selling, most listened to artists are going to stop being rock and roll artists. And we're starting to see precursors to this genre losing its grip as the most popular genre of music for the last 40 years.